Welcome to the Greener Way podcast, a show about people, planet, and purpose, and how investors and corporate leaders push forward in a complex world. On this episode of The Greener Way, we're pulling back the sustainably sourced, ethically manufactured curtain on our newsroom. Joining us is Rose Mary Petrass, senior journalist at FS Sustainability, to chat about what's going on in the sustainability headlines. Rose, welcome to the podcast. Please tell us who you are and what makes you so passionate about sustainability.
Hi, Rachel. Well, the idea of environmental stewardship was really instilled in me in a very young age. I grew up in rural Tasmania, which is a really special and beautiful place. And being surrounded by that nature, it really, I guess, taught me a lot. My childhood home was nearly burned down in a bushfire. So I really grew up understanding the beauty, but also the danger, the power of nature.
I think that's something a lot of investors realized in a big way in 2019, 2020, doing the bushfires. I know for me, smelling smoke every day sort of really put it front and center that climate change is something that's here for all of us. So you had a sneak preview of that as a child.
Yeah. And I think often, like living in the city now, you can feel like you're quite separate from nature. Like it's not really as in your face as it until the smoke arrives at your door, so to speak.
Very true.
Yeah. So, but I think kind of it's important to recognize that we are actually part of an ecosystem and we're dependent on it just like it is dependent on us. Also, coming from a scientific family who worked in the environment sector and in social work, I grew up with a very strong sense of the importance of both the E and the S in ESG, and understanding that there's no environmental movement without equity and inclusion. And it's important to take into account that these environmental harms are really inequitably distributed, and many marginalized groups, especially Indigenous peoples and emerging economies, are far more vulnerable to the effects of climate change and natural hazards. But also recognizing that Indigenous peoples hold unique knowledge systems and sustainable land management practices and protect 80% of biodiversity left in this world. So it's really important to recognize that and respect those cultures and communities that are really at risk. And we need to understand that we have a lot to learn from them.
This is such an important topic, Rose Mary, particularly, with the context of we're building through the rest of the year to the referendum on Indigenous voice in the Constitution. And I have a feeling that this is going to permeate all of our coverage at FS Sustainability, sort of in this political context, but then thereafter as well. So it's really interesting for you to bring that into this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Coincidence as well. Both my parents are social workers and rehab counselors as well. So we have a bit of that background similarity between the two of us as well. I really love that you're so intersectional about that E and that S, and that certainly comes through to me. You've hit the ground running in terms of stories and articles that you've written here at FS Sustainability, and you really do bring that intersectionality to the conversation, which I always appreciate. So let's talk a little bit about the big stories we've covered this week. For me, it was the research by a group of academics, including the University of New South Wales, that found that over 90 businesses in Australia say that they want more regulation when it comes to the Modern Slavery Act, which seems incongruous. You never hear from the business community that they want more regulation and more penalties for not reporting correctly on modern slavery. How about for you? What have you been covering this week and what stood out for you?
This week, I published a story called The Wild West of Blue Investing, and I found it really interesting. I know it has a bit of a funny title, but basically this was based off a talk at the Blue Solutions Summit held during the Ocean Lovers Festival in Sydney. So in the ESG world, we talk a lot about investing in land-based projects. So that would be, for example, reforestation projects, but we don't really talk a lot about sea-based projects. And the blue economy means economic activities that are related to or dependent on the ocean. So one statistic that really shocked me was that for every dollar spent in the blue economy, 97 cents is spent on something that might be harming the ocean, while only 3 cents is spent fixing it.
How
So
does that work out? How does it, can you provide any sort of depth on that statistic? Is it, like fisheries and sort of removal? I mean, that's shocking.
there's a lot of harmful practices when it comes to economic activities that are dependent on the ocean. It could be, for example, the fishery industry is very um, harmful on marine life. It destroys the ecosystem in quite a profound
Mm.
way. And I saw some statistic, but I might be wrong because I'm just remembering off the top of my head that by 2050, most of the fish that we eat every day or every week or very commonly, those are actually going to be extinct, and that's because of overfishing.
It's a unique opportunity, though, for Australia, being the island continent that we are, to play a leadership role, particularly in the region when it comes to coming up with water, sort of ocean-based solutions to climate change and biodiversity. So I look forward to seeing how you tackle that one in future.
It's funny that you said that because the investment piece to understand about the blue economy is that it's going to be worth $100 trillion in the coming years. And Australia has the third largest ocean exclusive economic zone in the world. So that is a lot of opportunity for investors that are interested in finding a way to help the planet in a way that's profitable for them and for their businesses. So, how can we contribute in a positive way? Some examples that they gave at this event were sailboat cargo ships, wind powered, if you will,
Hmm. Hmm.
robots that clean and repair boat hulls underwater, which cuts out a lot of the toxic chemicals that they use, and also floating photovoltaics with seaweed dangling underneath. So, projects like this are really important because they not only support marine biodiversity, but they also drive
Mm.
sustainable economic growth in emerging economies and in marginalized communities,
Mm.
particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and remote communities.
I think that's one definitely to keep an eye on, Rosemary, because as you say, particularly when it comes to sort of the top end of the country and traditional ownership of shallow waters, there's some really interesting traditional activities that I think could be turned into methodologies. I'm led to believe for carbon crediting with blue activity, which has that co-benefit that you're talking about in terms of impacting traditional owners of the land.
Yeah.
What are you going to be working on going forward, Rose? Give us a sneak peek of what's coming up in the coming weeks for you.
So at the moment, I'm writing about solar panel stewardship schemes, which is really interesting. The Australian renewable energy sector is grappling with the dilemma of what to do with 80 million solar panels at the end of life. That is more than 100,000 tonnes that are due to be dismantled in Australia from 2035. So, if you think about in the past couple of decades when solar has become more popular and accessible, all that solar that was installed over the past 10 to 20 years is going to soon come to end of life. And that is going to be a lot of waste if we can't find a circular solution for it. So, in a perfect circular economy world, we would keep all those materials within use for as long as possible through recycling so that waste can be minimized as much as possible. But at the moment, Australia has no national photovoltaics recycling scheme, but it's something that the government and industry groups have been looking at. The problem is making that economically viable for a product like PV, which is made
Mm.
from relatively inexpensive materials but with some rare elements. I've been speaking to some industry and researchers and different groups to find the solution, and our listeners will
Mm.
have to read my article when it's published to find out more.
They absolutely will. And it's interesting because, what is a risk now can also become a financial opportunity for companies that find that solution, and then for investors that invest and scale those solutions into larger companies. So we'll stay tuned for that. From my perspective, I've been thinking, Rosemary, about sort of the guarantees around carbon capture and storage. The IPCC sixth report said that in some way, shape, or form, carbon sequestration is going to be necessary for us to keep climate change contained at 1.5 or slightly above. If we're going to use carbon capture and storage as part of that solution, I have a lot of questions as to who's responsible for making sure that the carbon that's sequestered, however that is, that the carbon stays sequestered for infinity years to prevent increased climate change for our grandchildren, great grandchildren, and beyond. So I've been talking with a lot of lawyers. I've been talking with a lot of regulators, and we'll see what comes for that, because nobody seems to have a clear answer at this point. So to finish this one off, Rosemary, I would like to steal a page from one of my very favorite podcasters, Alan Alda of the Clear and Vivid podcast. He has fantastic scientists and experts on at the end of every podcast. He asks them fast questions to get a quick response to provide a little bit more information. So, Rose, I'm going to hit you with these questions, quick answers only. What do you wish you really understood?
That is a difficult question. I guess there's a lot that I don't really understand, like most people. I guess being in this space of, would you say, like climate journalism or environmental journalism, there is a lot of science that I don't really understand. And a lot of people ask me tricky questions. But I guess our job as journalists is to be good at communicating what other people are experts on and give them a voice and a platform. So I don't need to be an expert. I just need to be able to clearly communicate what the experts are saying.
Amen to that. How do you tell someone that they have their facts wrong?
The first step, I think, in changing someone's mind is empathy. I think empathy and listening are really important. A lot of the time, when someone says something that's completely incorrect or against your values or completely factually wrong, your first reaction might be to feel angry or personally attacked, or even to look down on them and dismiss them. But we can't really be dismissing ignorance, because it's the most dangerous thing in our society today, I think. There's a lot of fake news, a lot of conspiracy theories going around. So if you hear someone saying something that's not factual, your first reaction should be to stay calm and be respectful and try and lead them to realize that what they're saying doesn't really make sense, without embarrassing them or talking down to them. Just like creating that space for empathy and to create that safe space for a conversation to happen.
How do you strike up a real, genuine conversation, Rosemary?
Well, that comes back again to empathy and being generally interested in other people and their perspectives. People love to talk about themselves a lot. So we all need to create that skill to actively listen to each other. And that's a skill not just for journalists to have, but for everyone to have, I think, and really
Mm.
listen to each other and understand each other's perspectives.
Okay. And finally, Rose, what's the strangest question anyone has ever asked you?
So I've been asked a lot if choosing to go into this area of like environmental journalism or climate journalism is a depressing job. People say, that sounds so depressing. I could never do that. And I think that kind of reaction is really common in society at the moment. Like, I think we often feel really down about the climate crisis, or really despondent, and feel like there's nothing that we can do as individuals to make any difference. And the news is constantly telling us really terrible things, and scientists are trying to warn businesses and governments to change, but it seems like the needle is moving really slowly,
Mhm.
and it can be really overwhelming to even turn on the news. But I think it's really important to remember that if everyone thinks, oh, nothing I do can make a difference, then nothing will ever change. We need to, as a society, collectively hold onto that hope and make the changes that we can make today to move into a better future, and have optimism that the more that we have these kinds of discussions, because if someone asks you, is that's so depressing, it creates an opening to have that conversation with your friends, your family, your colleagues. And the more that we have that conversation, the more that other people will also make those changes, and not just kick the can down the road to the next generation. Yeah, these are critical years to make a difference. And I believe that if we can keep telling these stories, as communication professionals, but also anyone listening to this podcast in their everyday life, we need to keep having these conversations and create that hope that we can galvanize those in power and everyone in society to make a difference.
Excellent. Well, Rose Mary Petrass, Senior Journalist at FS Sustainability, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Greener Way podcast. If you liked today's show, remember to rate and review us on your podcast platform, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Any feedback? Contact us on podcast@fssustainability.com.au. I'm Rachel Allen Backus.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. FS Sustainability operates under an Australian Financial Service License and the exemption made available under the Corporations Act 2001 in respect to any information or advice given. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.